Thank you, David. I have seen that one, but I've never actually heard it. So I guess I'll have to go hunting for it now. So today, well, I won't start there. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for choosing to be part of this spiritual community. We know you had a choice, and we're delighted you chose to be here. Thank you to all the folks who have escaped the impressive Tucson heat and still tune in, courtesy of this Zoom technology. And thanks to all the local folks who tuned in too. So I want to start by mentioning this month's theme, because it sets the stage for the work we're going to do together this month. The theme is, what's mine to do? And the description, we each have gifts, talents, and skills that can be used to improve our lives and the lives of those around us. Do you know what is yours to do right now? How do you clear the path to make way to share your gifts? So I want to start in that uncomfortable and very familiar place of recognizing all the ways we get in our own way, things that keep us from acting on what we see as ours to do. I also want to mention the book for the month, which some of you have acquired, I know, or downloaded. It's David Richo's Triggers. Today I'll be working from the introduction and chapter 1. The first stop in discovering how we are in our own way is to see our blind spots. We get to see what we're unaware of, which is to say, we get to see what triggers us that we've hidden from ourselves. As we discover our blind spots, usually by stepping in them or tripping over them, we have a chance to choose differently and not be at the effect of these things, these old stories from our past that almost certainly are triggers. Or to say it another way, our memories of past experiences reactivate those past reactions that may or may not have been useful then and are almost certainly not useful now. So I've talked about my husband, my ex-husband, before. We had very different ways of being. And we experienced feeling comfortable in our comforted in our skins in extremely different ways. He wasn't a hoarder exactly, but he really, really liked to be surrounded by stuff. For him, stuff was love. That's how he grew up. That's what he knew. Mostly it was really nice stuff or really useful stuff, but there was an awful lot of it. And I became so accustomed to his piles of stuff, I quit seeing them. And after a decade, I noticed that I felt like I was drowning or suffocating in the marriage, and I couldn't figure out why. One thing I knew for sure, I had to get out. Where we were living in Ohio, you couldn't have an uncontested or mediated divorce without doing marriage counseling for a year. So we did that. I was also seeing a counselor at the time myself because I wanted to understand what was going on in me that created or supported such an unsupportive environment. Now, I didn't know about the science of mind philosophy yet, so, there is that. But anyway, when I described to the therapist the home environment I had been living in, she insisted that I go to the house that we no longer shared, and I still had a key and permission to enter, and take pictures. She assured me that this was important because my mind would try to tell me later that I had exaggerated the situation and it wasn't really that bad. It was. I didn't realize the extent of my blind spot about the state of my living conditions until I noticed that I was leaning up against a 3/4 inch thick 4x8 sheet of plywood that was leaning against the wall, leaning against the wall in the hallway, and had been there at least a year. So I could get a picture of one of the piles of stuff. We just don't see, we forget, we decide it's not important, we decide it doesn't matter. And it becomes a blind spot for us. So I make this man sound like he was an ogre, but he really wasn't. He was a very nice man and a very kind man, and in many ways a very thoughtful and considerate man. And we had wildly different value systems and ways of seeing and being in the world. My blind spot, and this is crazy, my blind spot was I didn't know at the time that what I needed mattered. Crazy, yeah. That was the world I was raised in. And even though I was old enough to know better, I didn't know better. Until suddenly I woke up and realized that the agreement I had made didn't actually have any space in it for me. It's like the joke about the frog in the pot of water. If you raise the temperature slowly, the frog won't jump out. Well, this frog jumped. The awareness finally dawned on me, and it wasn't okay, and I needed out. And I was in that pot of water for 10 years before it finally caught my attention, because I wasn't valuing myself, and so there was no way that he could, and he couldn't anyway, so it didn't matter either. But anyway, I needed to value myself. And the only way I could do that was to break that agreement. On pages 9 and 10 of Triggers, David Richo wrote, "In reality, triggers are tricksters. They make a two-part experience seem like one. This is because our reaction happens so close on the heels of the stimulating event. Actually, the trigger, part one of the experience, his language, is indeed instigated by someone else, but our reaction, part two, is our own responsibility and is built on our own past experiences." And this next sentence was the key for me. We are being bullied by our own unfinished business. My unfinished business then was I didn't value me. And so I was treating everyone around me to not value me either. Fortunately, we can learn from our old stories and change that. And so today I'm going to be talking about seeing our blind spots and learning how to rewrite that story or reframe that story so that we see it in a different way. And my story when I was young was I was Cinderella. So I only had value if I was in some kind of support role. And Cinderella's hard to kill, I have to tell you sometimes. She still shows up. But mostly we're past that sleeping in the ashes thing. There is a school of thought that suggests that we invite people to participate in our lives in certain ways that don't seem particularly nice to us because we have unconsciously or subconsciously asked them to help us wake up. Think about that the next time you want to be grumpy at somebody who's showing you an area in your life where you feel blindsided, or where someone has stomped on one of your blind spots, where you can be easily triggered. These are places where you are not completely healed. David Richo wrote, "It is up to us to explore the origin of our triggered reflexes and work on moving past them. We can learn how to do this. It will take seeing the trigger as a pointer to our work, rather than seeing it simply as a justified or justifiable reaction. When we can do this, we can use our triggers to arouse a curiosity about ourselves, rather than only a reaction to other people. Reactions are non-rational and automatic. You could even go so far as to say they are autonomic, like your heartbeat and your breathing, something that happens completely without thought. They arise from our reptile primitive brain, which, and this is the sneaky part, which created and stored reflexive reactions that happened to us before we actually had any autonomy or skill. When a reptilian response happens, the thinking part of our brain is never consulted when we feel threatened or when we even imagine feeling threatened. To the reptile brain, everything out of the ordinary is perceived as catastrophic, earth-shattering, and life-threatening. So if you've ever wondered why you overreacted so much to a particular event in your past, that's the reason. Your reptile brain was in charge. And having a blind spot revealed activates that reptile brain. Because it's like, oh, this is wrong. Oh my God, something I have to scream or run or something. We can mitigate, soften, override that response, that reaction, and it takes time, intention, and persistence. This is one of the reasons regular spiritual practices are so important. We can learn to stop that reaction train before it leaves the station, or catch it before it gets too far. And take a breath, or 2 or 5. Reconsider the events, reframe them, and come up with an alternative response that gives us options for a more positive outcome, instead of just defaulting to fight, flight, or freeze. You may remember that quote that has long been attributed incorrectly to Viktor Frankl. There was actually a Stephen Covey paraphrase of something that was probably written by Rollo in 1963. You're going, what on earth are you talking about? Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. It is the topic that Frankl was talking about in Man's Search for Meaning, but the quote doesn't exist in his writings. I'll read that again. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. David Richo takes the same idea and spins it slightly differently. He wrote, "A trigger can dead end by leading only to a reaction, with no resource that would allow us to cope with that reaction. Triggers don't have to end that way. Once we have tools to handle them, we can insert a third option between stimulus and response." He goes on to describe what he means, and he says, the default way of thinking, trigger leads to reaction. It can become trigger leads to reaction, leads to resource, or leads to option, and then eventually, with practice, can lead to trigger and resource. This is what Dr. Carmen was talking about last week when she described standing with those white police officers at the location of Robert Fuller's hanging death in Palmdale, California. She intentionally and deliberately, mindfully moved from a reactive state, fear, anger, upset, even sadness, grief, despair at the death of that young Black man, to a place of love and compassion. And she talked about that in last week's talk. So if you weren't here last week or haven't watched it on YouTube, please give yourself the gift of 30 minutes and watch it on our YouTube channel. It's not something that happens easily or lightly, but it is something we can choose to move from that reptilian reaction to something more thoughtful and useful. So, how often do we feel blindsided by events or circumstances in our lives? Certainly, we have plenty of options to choose from right now. But what are we blindsided by really? Most often, we get blindsided by our expectations that things will be different than they are, that our experience will be different than it is. So a story from this week, those of you who have been in morning practice have heard parts of this. I had a handyman give me a quote to do some work on a porch some number of weeks ago, and we finally scheduled the work for this past week. The wood on the awnings was dry rotted when I bought the house, and I've been avoiding getting it fixed. So he started working on it and then realized how badly the wooden fascia boards that attached the porch to the house they were dry rotted too. And so a porch that's attached to rotted boards doesn't work. So he was looking at having to replace those too. And I really had suspected they were pretty bad. And I knew I didn't want to know, which is part of the reason I had avoided getting anybody in to look at the job for a couple of years. Not only were the fascia boards bad, but the plywood behind them wasn't in any better shape. So it's a total real mess, and more than double the work he had initially quoted. So we're looking at this mess, and he asks me if I'm upset, because he wanted to blame the inspector for not catching it. And I got to stand there and look at the mess and swallow hard and stare at the mess and take a breath. And finally move myself to the place that I could be grateful that I could actually get the carport cover, the roof, and the porches fixed properly, not band-aided and haphazardly patched like they had been done by 2 or 3 or possibly even 4 of the previous owners of my townhouse. Did I do that easily or lightly? No. Was it possible? Yeah, because I knew what I wanted as my outcome, which is I wanted to have this so that it would last another 40 years, even if I wouldn't be around to see it. So I knew I wanted it fixed properly, so I could get past that upset, that irritation, that angst, that unhappiness at, all the stuff that was wrong. And, I didn't get any rain at my house or wind or dust or anything else, which is really good considering I have a half-finished porch. So there is that. So triggers happen. They happen all the time. We have our blind spots revealed to us. That happens. And then we're surprised or disturbed or upset or irritated. And then we get to decide, when we can stop long enough to think, whether we're going to be at the effect of those experiences or be able to see them with some kind of new eyes, in some kind of positive or beneficial light. There's an old joke that folks that have been around the center for a while will likely remember. When you're looking at a barn full of horse manure, you have a couple choices. You can be upset at having to clean out the barn, or you can be excited, because if there's that much horse manure, there's bound to be a pony in there somewhere. So today's spiritual thought, Ernest Holmes from Love and Law. Hear this with new ears. Practically the whole human race is hypnotized because it thinks what somebody else told it to think. It thinks from its physical environment. The impersonal, eternal law receives the impression of my thought, and if I say everything is wrong, then it's wrong. In Christian Science, they call it the law of reflection. Like produces like attracts like draws to itself like, always. So there's that, right? And Dr. Holmes also recognized that we're smart enough and capable enough to know that we have the ability to choose something other than default thinking, reactive thinking, and having reactive experiences. When we pay attention and notice we're triggered, we can see our blind spots for what they are. Information. Last week, Dr. Carmen called them bad instructions. Yesterday morning, the daily practice group read in 365 Science of Mind, page 206, whatever we identify ourselves with, we tend to become. Whatever we think about gradually becomes a subconscious pattern, always tending to manifest itself in our experiences. Law reflects to us what we are. If we're willing to have a different experience, we have to choose and consistently choose to have that different experience, and then reinforce it again and again within ourselves until it becomes our new de facto response. That's how we change our own experience. And this is the piece most people miss. That's also how we change subjective mind, or the experience of the collective consciousness. We change our own point of view and actually infect everyone else with this new point of view of something that is beneficial or supportive or uplifting or inclusive. So it's subversive in a really fun kind of way. So what's mine to do? Consciously keep my own mind tidy and in order and focused on the highest good for me and for all. And make sure I really, truly do mean all. And clean out any skeletons in my closet that I find that don't serve that intention. Not a bit of this is new. Not a bit of this is rocket science. You've heard most of it, if not all of it, before. It only has value when we continuously practice it and reinforce it over and over and over again for ourselves and practice it with each other. The good news is we're not alone in this effort. Absolutely everything in the universe supportively responds to our choosing. The universe says yes. We have to be careful and clear about what we're asking it to support. In the practice of nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg and his younger colleague, Thom, realized that shifting our focus towards using connecting language in the place of judgment or habitual language moves us from disconnection and conflict to a place of connection and understanding. An example of that, in 2018, there was a hostage situation at a Trader Joe's in Silver Lake, California. And one of the women who was inside the Trader Joe's at the time, by the name of Mary Linda, doesn't know why she did it, but she realized that if she could connect with that young man who had killed people and was very upset and very disturbed and very irrational, if she could connect with him as a human, odds would go up that the conflict would be reduced. And it was, and she did. And she walked him out of that, and no one else got hurt. When we can shift our focus towards connecting language in place of judgment or habitual language, we move from disconnection and conflict to connection and understanding. That's big. That's huge. And it starts when we can be in charge of ourselves enough to not be triggered, to not operate from our own reptile minds. This is actually a major part of what Keith Gorley's Saturday morning discussion group is talking about as they work their way through Karen Armstrong's 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. It sounds like a nothing thing, but it's actually a big deal, and it's something every single one of us has the ability, has the tools, has the awareness, has the capability to do. We just have to actually own it and step up and engage in that way. I was watching a little piece of a recorded interview with Brother David Steindl-Rast last night. His belief, and I agree, is that all religions and all spiritual belief systems support gratitude and compassion, and all of them are actually all inclusive when you get down to it. No individual and no group can ever be excluded because there's really only one of us. And what we do to one, we do to all. Have you ever heard that before? In the prologue to Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Suzuki wrote, "For the Zen students, the most important thing is not to be dualistic, not to be either or, not to be good, bad. Our original mind includes everything within itself. It is always rich and sufficient within itself. This does not mean having a closed mind, but it actually means having an empty mind. What does empty mean? Not thoughtless or mindless. It means free of preconceptions, free of distractions, free of old limiting stories, free of triggers, free of blind spots, free of any previous decisions that make you or anyone else smaller or less important or less valuable than they actually are." So I'll start that sentence beginning again. This does not mean to have a closed mind, but actually an empty mind and a ready mind. Ready is present, available, engaged, and willing. Can we have an empty mind, an available mind, and a present mind, willing and engaged? He finishes, "If your mind is empty, it is always ready for anything. It is open for everything. And then this is the quote that most people have heard before. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So I want to close with an old friend, a poem by David White that made me laugh the first time I read it. It's called Everything is Waiting for You. Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone, as if life were a progressive and cunning crime with no witnesses to the tiny hidden transgressions. To feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of your surroundings. Surely even you at times have felt the grand array, the swelling presence, and the chorus crowding out your solo voice. You must note the way the soap dish enables you, or the window latch grants you freedom. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. The stairs are your mentor of things to come. The doors have always been there to frighten you and invite you. The tiny speaker in your phone is your dream ladder to divinity. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. The kettle is singing even as it pours you a drink. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. All the birds and creatures of the world are unutterably themselves. Everything is waiting for you. So take a breath and imagine what it would feel like if you were able to approach every single circumstance in your life from that point of view. Everything is waiting for you to rise up and become that full, infinite expression, that whole and holy person that is actually who you are in all conditions, all circumstances, all events, all experiences of your life. Put that on. See what it feels like. And imagine stepping into that more and more and more often. It's pretty fabulous. Do that. Bless yourself and bless us all. Thank you. So I want to go ahead and roll into the prayer, community prayer. So if you can imagine something in your life that you'd like to see a new way to be during, in, as, hold that in your consciousness and allow the possibility of that as I speak the words. That infinite radiance that I know as the one mind, that divine presence, that whole and holy experience that lives as all of life, that lives as me, that lives as each one, as our most joyous, most expansive, most delightful, most exuberant expression. I claim that truth right this minute for me and for all beings. That brightness, that emanation of the oneness as each one's capital T truth. And as we do this, as we step into this full expression of ourselves, we can't help but infect everybody else with our radiance. What a lovely thing to share. And as we know, infections are contagious. So let's imagine sharing this goodness, sharing this light, sharing this greater joy, this brighter expression, seeing the world, that new heaven and that new earth, as a place worth and worthy of our livingness. So I imagine this is the end of the rainbow. We are living in that space and time when we step into it. So I breathe into that image and I give it more and more life. And I know that same truth is possible and probable and available to any who choose to accompany me on this adventure. Grateful for this awareness, grateful for this way of seeing and knowing, grateful for this opportunity to remember, grateful for all the chances that appear and occur that allow this growth to happen. I celebrate this day. I celebrate this gathering. I celebrate the whole holiness of this experience called life. And I bless each one. I feel so grateful to be part of it. And I relax into this, knowing it's not work, it's just awareness. And I let it be. And so it is.
Oh, let me